What if humanity's survival rested on one final chance to outwit an alien empire that knows no mercy? In this story, you'll witness humanity's unyielding struggle to fight for what was stolen, as the balance of power teeters on the edge of destruction. The video opens with a breathtaking, tension-filled moment. Humanity's last fleet is surrounded by a powerful Kylorian armada. The ships are battered, on the brink of collapse, but the warriors aboard are determined. Their goal? Not just to survive, but to take revenge on an alien empire that has ravaged their worlds and destroyed their futures. The video flashes back to the beginning of the war, when the Kylorians first struck, overwhelming humanity's defenses with ruthless efficiency. Colonies fell, cities burned, and what remained of humanity was scattered across the galaxy, fighting for scraps. But in the ashes of defeat, a new resistance rises. The battle isn't just for survival anymore, it's a fight for justice, for redemption, and for a chance to rebuild what was lost. We meet Captain Elena Devereaux, a determined leader whose family was slaughtered in the initial Kylorian attack. She embodies the pain of humanity's loss, but channels that pain into a burning desire for revenge. Alongside her is Yarrick, a former diplomat whose past failures now drive him to outthink the alien invaders at every turn. And then there's Lila, a young engineer who has turned her skills into weapons of war. Together, they form an unlikely team bound by one purpose: to make the Kylorians pay. The central themes of the video are clear: survival, revenge, and transformation. Humanity's fight is more than physical, it's emotional. Each of our heroes is scarred by their past, but as the war escalates, they evolve into something far greater than they were before. The emotional highs of the video are raw and impactful: moments of betrayal, the sacrifice of allies, and the haunting question of whether the cost of victory will be worth it. The stakes are personal for each character. Can Captain Devereaux find peace through vengeance, or will her thirst for retribution blind her to the bigger picture? Will Yarrick's tactical genius be enough to outsmart the Kylorians, or will his past mistakes doom humanity's future? And will Lila's innovations be enough to tip the scales in humanity's favor before it's too late? The tension builds as the Resistance prepares for the final confrontation, one last battle that could either save humanity or destroy it forever. As the Kylorians draw closer, our heroes must face impossible choices, and the outcome will depend on more than just firepower. It will come down to courage, ingenuity, and the strength of the human spirit. Will humanity reclaim its place in the stars, or will the galaxy fall into the hands of an alien empire? The war for survival and revenge is just beginning. The universe is vast, a sprawling expanse of darkness speckled with pinpricks of light. But beyond the glittering stars and the swaths of distant nebulae, there's a war, one that's consumed the very fabric of space and life itself. The silence of space is shattered by the distant hum of warships, their hulls scarred from countless battles. This is a galaxy at war. A war that has altered everything. Beneath the endless void, the once thriving human colonies are now little more than fractured remnants of their former selves. What was once a peaceful, harmonious stretch of planets and moons, linked by trade and shared history, is now a broken battlefield. The few remaining colonies on distant worlds are isolated, fighting not only against alien invaders but against the harsh conditions of a dying galaxy. The bright green fields of Earth, forever lost, have been replaced by smoldering craters and the constant churn of war. A deadly peace, if there ever was one, has long since passed. The Kylorians, an advanced alien empire, had struck without warning. Their ships were massive and black, blocking out stars as they descended from the heavens. With technological prowess that surpassed anything humanity had ever seen, they swept through human-held systems like a storm, tearing apart everything in their path. The once vibrant skies of the colonies, once dotted with the colorful trails of interstellar ships and the distant flash of artificial cities, now sit eerily empty. Now, only the burning remnants of humanity's failures linger in the night. The air is thick with the smell of metal and burning ozone, the sounds of distant explosions reverberating through the ruined hulls of once proud human ships. The sky, what little of it remains visible through the cloud of dust and debris, has turned an unnatural, sickly shade of red. Solar winds howl through the wreckage of space stations, their once bright metal frames now twisted, fractured, and slowly floating towards the void, abandoned by those who once worked and lived there. On the ground of the remaining human worlds, life is a grim struggle. The atmosphere is heavy, as if the planet itself is holding its breath, waiting for the next wave of destruction. Cities that once buzzed with life are now dark, their lights dimmed, with only flickering holograms casting faint shadows on the streets below. The skies are perpetually clouded, as if nature itself is in mourning for the billions who've perished. In space, humanity's remaining fleet is a fractured force. The ships, once sleek and full of purpose, now appear like ghosts. The creaks of their aging frames echo in the void, while the dull hum of their failing engines fills the otherwise silent space. The once pristine shields that protected humanity's colonies are now riddled with scars, bullet holes from alien weaponry and burnt-out power cores. Yet, these ships are all that remain of humanity's defense. There is no grandeur to them now, just a desperate fight for survival. Tensions are palpable. Each moment is a countdown, whether on the surface of a dying planet or in the empty expanse of space. The mood is thick with hopelessness, but beneath it is something raw and unyielding, the human spirit, refusing to die without a fight. The atmosphere, heavy with the sense of impending doom, is punctuated only by the occasional flare of light as the remnants of human firepower attempt to fend off the endless tide of Kylorian vessels. This is no longer a fight for territory. It's a battle for existence itself. Humanity is not fighting to reclaim what was lost, but to ensure that their species does not fade into nothingness, forgotten and erased by the Kylorians. The stars, once a symbol of hope and infinite potential, now stand as silent witnesses to the fragile, flickering ember of humanity's will to survive. In the silence of space, amidst the rubble of destruction, a question lingers, unspoken but understood by all who remain. Can humanity endure long enough to turn the tide, or will they become just another forgotten casualty of the galaxy's cold, indifferent war? The horizon of the distant planet was barely visible through the haze of burning debris and thick, black smoke. The last remaining human fleet drifted near the remains of a broken space station, a silent monument to a war that had already claimed too much. No longer a symbol of progress, this once thriving outpost now served as a grim reminder of what had been lost: families, cities, entire worlds. The fleet's commanders, a mix of seasoned veterans and desperate survivors, sat in cold, dimly lit control rooms. The hum of machinery filled the void, a constant reminder that they were still fighting, still holding on by a thread. But the thread was thin, and it wouldn't last much longer. For weeks, the Kylorians had been launching relentless attacks, tightening their grip on the human colonies like a vice. The humans, despite their desperation, had managed to hold off their superior forces with guerrilla tactics, hiding, striking when they could, and retreating into the shadows when outmatched. But each victory was fleeting, and each loss was catastrophic. The situation was growing worse by the day. Supplies were running low, morale was shattered, and the fleet was dangerously close to collapse. Worse still, the Kylorians were adapting. They had learned to counter the few human strategies that had worked, making the next attack even more devastating than the last. On the bridge of the flagship, Commander Caleb Ward looked over the flickering holomap of their fleet's position. His face, a mix of weariness and grim determination, betrayed the toll the war had taken. Around him, officers moved swiftly, eyes darting to screens, fingers hovering over buttons, but there was no excitement, only the cold realization that the odds of survival were slipping away with each passing hour. "We've got incoming," a voice crackled from the comms. The message was clear, but the terror in the officer's voice was unmistakable. Ward's eyes flicked to the dark space ahead of them, where the enemy fleet had appeared without warning, just like all the times before. The Kylorians were getting faster, more strategic. And this time, they weren't just here for another raid, they were here to finish what they started. An ominous pulse of light flickered in the distance, an armada of Kylorian warships, their dark silhouettes dominating the space around them, their weapons primed and ready. The Kylorians had become a relentless storm, a shadow that blotted out the stars, and now they were closing in with deadly precision. Their fleet, massive and overwhelming, outnumbered the humans by an unspeakable margin. Ward's fingers clenched around the edge of the command console. His mind raced. What's the plan now? Around him, the officers scrambled to prepare the fleet for battle, but it was clear that their options were running out. There were no reinforcements coming. no backup on the horizon. Just them and a hostile force that showed no mercy. "What's our status on the defense systems?" Ward demanded, trying to keep the panic from creeping into his voice. "We're at 20% efficiency on shields," came the quick reply. "The remaining batteries are unstable. We'll be lucky to get a few more hours before we're completely exposed." Ward gritted his teeth. A few more hours? Humanity's entire survival was now dependent on the fragility of their remaining defenses. As the fleet continued to prepare for the oncoming battle, something gnawed at the back of Ward's mind, a bitter realization that humanity had been fighting the wrong war all along. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to preserve the very essence of what made them human: resilience, ingenuity, and the unbreakable will to keep going, no matter the odds. But now, even that was under threat. In the depths of the flagship, beneath the bridge, in the nerve center of the fleet, another conflict was quietly stirring. Lieutenant Kara Hayes, a quiet but fiercely loyal officer, sat at her station, her fingers dancing over a terminal. She was analyzing the incoming Kylorian fleet's movement, scanning for patterns in their assault strategy. But what she discovered was far more troubling than she could have ever imagined. The Kylorians weren't just attacking the fleet, they were targeting specific vessels, seemingly with a precision that suggested they knew more than they should. More than any ordinary enemy would. She had seen this kind of strategy before. It was the kind of tactics used when someone knew their enemy's weakness. But how? The question echoed in her mind. What did the Kylorians know that they shouldn't? What could they be planning that the humans hadn't anticipated? It wasn't just a war of strength anymore. It was a war of secrets. And if they didn't figure out what the Kylorians were after, they might not live long enough to find out. As Ward surveyed the rapidly approaching enemy fleet, the grim weight of the situation settled on him. The Kylorians were no longer just invaders, they were manipulators, shaping the battlefield in ways humanity had yet to fully understand. And as the first volley of enemy fire lit up the blackened sky, the conflict became something more personal. The fight wasn't just for survival. It was for the future of every human still alive, and for the unknown costs of what might be lost if they failed to win. The first shot landed with a deafening roar, a massive explosion that shook the very foundation of the fleet. The flagship's shields flickered, almost giving way, before stabilizing. But the damage had been done. The Kylorians had fired a warning shot, a strike so powerful that it sent shockwaves through the human ships, knocking out communication systems and causing temporary chaos across the fleet. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the steady beeping of damage reports flooding the bridge. Commander Ward stood frozen for a moment, his eyes fixed on the shattered image of the approaching Kylorian fleet. The enemy ships, massive and black like the void itself, filled the screen. They were moving in close now, with cold, calculated precision, as if this moment had been long in the making. "Captain, shields are down to 15%, shouted one of the officers. The words hit Ward like a cold punch. 15%. They had less than a minute before the fleet would be completely exposed. Every human vessel was now vulnerable, hanging on by a thread. The air on the bridge was thick with tension, each officer had already mentally prepared themselves for the inevitable. The Kylorians were here to finish what they started, and the end seemed imminent. "We can't hold out much longer," Ward muttered, his voice betraying the weight of responsibility. The crew looked to him for answers, but in the depths of his mind, Ward knew this was it. They had failed. Just as the thought crossed his mind, a new message came through, crackling over the comms. It wasn't from the Kylorians. It was from an encrypted human channel. His heart skipped a beat as he saw the transmission source. "This is Dr. Serena Volkov, Chief Scientist of the Galactic Defense Initiative. Emergency transmission." Ward snapped to attention. Dr. Volkov was one of the few remaining experts on Kylorian technology. Her work had been instrumental in developing humanity's most advanced weapons. If she had information, it could be the key to survival, or at least a fighting chance. "Commander Ward, listen carefully," the voice crackled through the static. "We've just discovered something catastrophic. The Kylorians, this attack, it's not just about subjugation. It's about something far worse. They've discovered a way to terraform human planets. Not just through conventional means, but through a process that could erase entire ecosystems. Their goal isn't just to conquer, it's to wipe out humanity completely, starting with Earth's original colonies. Ward felt his chest tighten. Terraforming? Erasing ecosystems? The Kylorians weren't here to occupy, they were here to annihilate. The gravity of Dr. Volkov's words slammed into him with full force. The enemy wasn't just aiming at human ships, they were targeting humanity's very existence, erasing every trace of their history, their culture, their homeworlds. As the transmission continued, Ward's hand trembled as he gripped the console. If we don't act immediately, they'll begin with the core systems within 72 hours, Dr. Volkov continued, her voice urgent and filled with fear. The weapon, the Kylorian device, it's in their flagship. Destroy it, and we have a chance. If not, humanity as we know it will cease to exist. Ward's mind raced. The Kylorians had never shown their full hand, but now it was clear, this war was no longer just a matter of losing colonies or ships, it was about losing everything. The weight of his responsibility grew heavier with each passing second. The Kylorians weren't just invaders, they were an existential threat. "Commander, what's the order?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. It was Lieutenant Hayes, her face tight with worry. Ward's eyes flickered back to the approaching Kylorian fleet. Every officer in the room was watching him, waiting for him to make a decision. And in that moment, a terrible realization settled over him, this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was humanity's last stand. "We have to destroy their flagship," Ward said, his voice steady but laced with an urgency that matched the ticking clock. "If we don't, it's over. But we don't have the firepower. We'll need a miracle." The silence in the room was palpable as the crew absorbed his words. A few seconds later, the tension broke. Hayes looked at him with a hard, determined expression. "Then we'll find a way, sir. No matter what it takes." Ward nodded grimly, his mind now focused on the impossible task ahead. The plan was simple, strike the heart of the Kylorian fleet. But nothing about it felt simple. The flagship was heavily fortified, its defenses far beyond anything they could handle head-on. Yet, with time running out and humanity's fate hanging by a thread, Ward knew there was no other choice. As the fleet prepared for the assault, the stakes had never been clearer. This was their last chance to fight back, to seize control of their fate, or face utter annihilation. The conflict had escalated from survival to defiance, and the fight was now a race against time to prevent a catastrophe that could erase humanity from the galaxy forever. The first shots had been fired. The war, now at its most critical juncture, was about to take a turn for the worse. And with it, a desperate, dangerous path forward. The first wave of attack came without warning, a barrage of concentrated firepower that lit up the blackness of space with a brutal flash. The human fleet, already battered and on the verge of collapse, had no time to prepare. The Kylorians struck with surgical precision, their ships closing in from all sides, their weapons cutting through the weak shields of the human vessels like a hot knife through butter. On the flagship, Commander Ward watched the chaos unfold, his face ashen with the realization that their time was running out. The explosions from the Kylorian fire rocked the ship, sending jolts of panic through the crew. Systems began to fail, power flickering on and off as the human fleet struggled to stay operational. "Shields at 5%, Commander," an officer shouted, the panic in their voice mirroring the desperation in Ward's chest. The reality of the situation hit hard. The remaining human fleet was no longer capable of defending itself. What had started as a desperate last stand had now become a suicide mission. The hope of victory felt distant, like an unreachable star, and the cold truth was undeniable. Unless they struck back with everything they had, this war would be over in hours. Ward's eyes flicked across the battlefield. In the distance, the Kylorian flagship loomed, a massive, imposing silhouette that seemed to dwarf everything in its path. The weapon, the one that could wipe out humanity's remaining colonies, was housed somewhere within its depths. The odds of getting close enough to destroy it seemed impossible, but Ward had no choice. He had given the order, there was no turning back. "Prepare to launch the assault," Ward barked, his voice barely audible over the din of alarms and commotion. "We're going to have to fight our way to their flagship. I don't care how many we lose, this ends now." But even as the order left his lips, the weight of the decision began to settle over him. His crew was exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally drained from a war that seemed to have no end. The morale was in shambles. Even with the determination in their eyes, Ward knew that many of his crew members were fighting more out of desperation than hope. As the fleet launched into the fray, an eerie silence fell over the bridge. The battlefield was a swirling mass of chaos, human ships attempting to break through the Kylorian lines, while the alien fleet continued to press in from all sides. The clash of weaponry, the flashing lights of explosions, and the ever-present hum of the failing ship systems filled the air. The metallic taste of fear was palpable. Minutes turned into hours, and the human fleet, though outmatched, fought valiantly. But the Kylorians were relentless. Every moment seemed to deepen the gravity of their situation. There was no chance of escape now. On one of the smaller human vessels, the young pilot, who had once trained to fly through peaceful skies, was now fighting for his life. His hands gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles were white, and sweat poured down his face as he maneuvered through the deadly crossfire. Each ship that fell was a friend lost, each explosion a reminder of how fragile their survival was. The faces of those who had fallen haunted his every move, urging him to keep going, even as the Kylorians closed in. Below deck on another ship, a group of engineers worked feverishly to keep the systems intact, running to one part of the ship after another, patching up holes, rerouting power, and doing everything they could to delay the inevitable. One of them, a seasoned officer who had long since lost count of how many times he'd done this, looked at his crew with a grim expression. "How much longer?" one of the engineers asked, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "Not much," the officer replied, his tone low. "We're running on fumes. We're all running on fumes." Back on the flagship, Ward's thoughts were racing. As the battle raged, something else was weighing heavily on him, the realization he couldn't ignore. The Kylorians weren't just a threat to human life, they were a threat to everything that humanity stood for. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about preserving the very soul of their species. The Kylorians were not merely invaders, they were a force of complete annihilation. And the more Ward fought, the more he began to understand the true stakes of this war. The desperation of his people was becoming evident. Even the toughest soldiers, those who had endured through years of conflict, were now showing signs of breaking. The toll of constant loss, the weight of watching friends and comrades fall in battle, was too much for some. And for those still standing, the question lingered, what are we really fighting for? Is there a future worth saving, or is this just a death march to the inevitable? But as long as the enemy's flagship remained intact, humanity's hope remained alive, if only just. Ward knew that every minute they bought could mean more lives lost, but it could also mean a chance to turn the tide. The Kylorians were arrogant, overconfident in their superiority. Perhaps that was their biggest mistake. As the human fleet advanced, a feeling of unity spread among the crew. It wasn't a feeling of hope, but of resolve to fight, even when they knew the odds were stacked against them. But with every passing moment, the lines between life and death blurred. For some, the journey ahead would end in an explosion, a final act of defiance. For others, the war would continue, an unrelenting, unsolvable puzzle that only became more complex with time. And yet, through it all, one question remained: would humanity survive the Kylorian onslaught, or would they become nothing more than a distant memory in a galaxy of eternal darkness? The battle had entered its most desperate phase. The human fleet was barely holding on, but the Kylorians, relentless and unyielding, showed no signs of slowing. Ships on both sides had been reduced to burning wrecks, their shattered remains floating through the endless void of space. The flagship, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a hollow shell, barely holding together under the barrage of Kylorian weapons. Commander Ward stood at the center of the bridge, staring grimly at the unfolding destruction. The tension was suffocating, the air thick with the sounds of blaring alarms and the rhythmic thrum of failing engines. The human fleet was struggling, every ship engaged in a fight for survival, but even the bravest hearts were beginning to falter. Shields at 1%, Commander, an officer shouted, his voice rising with panic. Ward's hands clenched into fists. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. He'd watched too many lives lost, too many ships reduced to nothing more than debris. And yet, the Kylorians seemed unstoppable. The more the humans fought, the more it felt like they were playing into the enemy's hands. But then, a strange thing happened, something that would forever change the course of the war. A message came through on a secured channel, a transmission so heavily encrypted that it took several moments to decode. It was from Dr. Volkov, the scientist who had revealed the Kylorian weapon to Ward. She had been working on an analysis of the enemy's fleet, trying to uncover any weakness they might exploit. This transmission wasn't just another distress call, it was a discovery, something that made Ward's heart race. The message was simple, but its implications were staggering. Commander Ward, Dr. Volkov's voice came through the crackling comms, I've just uncovered something that changes everything. The Kylorians, they're not just invaders. They've been hiding a secret weapon, a far greater force than we ever imagined. They have the ability to manipulate time itself. Ward froze. The words hung in the air, impossible to comprehend. Time manipulation? It sounded like something out of a myth. But the urgency in Volkov's voice told him this wasn't a fantasy. How is that possible? Ward managed to force out. They have a device, Volkov continued. It's called the temporal cradle. It's embedded within the heart of their flagship. If activated, it will allow them to alter the timeline of the galaxy. They can rewrite history, erase our victories, and wipe out entire civilizations before they ever had a chance to fight. It's not just about conquering humanity. It's about erasing us entirely from existence. The word struck like a lightning bolt, shattering everything Ward had believed about the war. The Kylorians weren't just attempting to destroy humanity, they were trying to rewrite reality itself. They had the power to undo everything, to erase every sacrifice made, every victory fought for. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the very fabric of time and existence. Ward's mind raced. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If the Kylorians succeeded, the future they had been fighting for would cease to exist. It would be as if the war had never happened. All the lives lost, the struggles endured, would be wiped away in a heartbeat. And with the temporal cradle in their hands, the Kylorians could control not just the present, but the past and future as well. Humanity's fate was now inextricably tied to a battle far beyond the scope of anything they had ever imagined. We have to destroy the temporal cradle, Ward said, his voice resolute. That's the key to stopping them. But as he spoke, a harsh reality settled over him. The Kylorian flagship was impenetrable, its defenses far beyond anything they had the strength to breach. And the temporal cradle was likely buried deep within the ship, guarded by the most advanced security systems the Kylorians had ever created. Ward knew there was no easy path forward. The stakes had escalated beyond anything he had prepared for. This wasn't just about surviving the battle, it was about stopping the Kylorians from erasing humanity from existence. And in order to do that, they would need to infiltrate the heart of the enemy fleet, face unimaginable obstacles, and fight not just for their lives, but for the very future of the galaxy itself. The tension on the bridge was unbearable as Ward looked at his officers, their faces filled with a mixture of disbelief and determination. This is it, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the moment. We're no longer fighting for survival. We're fighting for our place in history. We take out the temporal cradle, or we lose everything. The choice was clear now. The conflict had reached its turning point. There was no turning back. The war had changed. And with it, so had the stakes. The Kylorian flagship loomed ahead, an unyielding fortress in the heart of the galaxy, its massive silhouette cutting through the void like a shadow of death. The human fleet, battered and broken, had somehow managed to fight their way into range. Only a handful of ships remained, their shields flickering, weapons systems malfunctioning, but their resolve was unbroken. They were the last hope. They had no choice but to charge forward and face the unimaginable. Commander Ward stood at the helm of his flagship, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The crew, exhausted and battle-worn, were still at their posts, their eyes fixed on the massive enemy vessel ahead. The Kylorians had known no mercy, and they would show none now. But if they were to stop them, if humanity was to have any future at all, this was it. There would be no second chances. "All hands, brace for impact," Ward commanded, his voice calm but laced with the tension of what was to come. "Prepare to launch the final assault. We're going in." The crew went silent, the gravity of the mission sinking in. Their ships were outgunned, outmatched, and their resources nearly depleted. But as they had learned from this long and brutal war, it was never about the odds. It was about fighting for the future, for the chance to make sure humanity's story didn't end in the cold silence of space. "We have to disable their engines first," Ward continued, his gaze never leaving the massive enemy flagship on the view screen. "If we don't, we'll never get close enough to destroy the temporal cradle." "We're almost in range, Commander," Lieutenant Hayes reported, her voice steady despite the chaos that surrounded them. "Enemy defenses are still holding strong." Ward nodded grimly. The Kylorians knew they were coming. The flagship had already begun firing, its weapons slicing through space with terrifying accuracy. But the human fleet was determined to make it through. Every ship would have to play its part. "Focus fire on their primary engines," Ward barked. "We need to cripple them before they can bring all their firepower to bear." The battle erupted in full force. The human fleet surged forward, the remaining ships diving headlong into the heart of the Kylorian defenses. Plasma cannons and energy beams flashed through space, illuminating the battlefield in a deadly dance of destruction. Human ships fired relentlessly at the Kylorian flagship's engine cores, the only way to disable the temporal cradle before it could tear apart everything humanity had fought for. Ward's heart pounded as he watched the action unfold. Their ships were outgunned, their chances slim, but they fought with everything they had. He knew that the next few minutes would determine their fate. As the enemy flagship fired back, sending massive bolts of energy streaking toward the human ships, Ward watched helplessly as one of their smaller vessels was torn apart in an instant. The crew, their friends, lost in a blink. "Hold steady," Ward shouted over the din of explosions. "We can't falter now." The human ships continued their assault, maneuvering in tight formations to avoid the Kylorian fire. But even as they pressed forward, the sheer scale of the Kylorian firepower became clear. For every hit they landed, it seemed like the Kylorians retaliated with twice the force. The human fleet was on the brink of annihilation. And then it happened. With a sickening roar, one of the Kylorian destroyers broke through the human line. Its weapons locked onto Ward's flagship, and before anyone could react, a massive blast ripped through the hull. Sparks flew from every console. Crew members screamed as the ship was rocked by the explosion. Ward was thrown against the command table, his head slamming into the metal surface. Blood dripped down his face as he struggled to rise, his vision blurry, but his focus unbroken. "We're losing power, Commander," shouted an officer from across the bridge. "The engines are compromised." Ward gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain. "Can we still move?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "We're not going to make it unless we take out that Kylorian flagship. Now." There was no time to waste. Ward's head cleared, and he snapped back into focus. His decision was final. They had one chance left, and he couldn't afford to hesitate. "We're boarding the flagship. We take that temporal cradle out, or we all die trying." Hayes looked at him, her expression fierce but uncertain. "You're serious, aren't you?" Ward nodded, his jaw set. "We're the last hope. If we don't stop them now, everything we've fought for, everything we've lost, it'll be for nothing." He turned to the crew, each of them knowing the gravity of what they were about to do. The human fleet had done its part to hold the Kylorians at bay. Now, it was up to a small team of soldiers and engineers to infiltrate the flagship and destroy the temporal cradle before the Kylorians could activate it. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only mission. "I'll lead the boarding party," Ward said, his voice steady now. "Prepare to launch assault pods." The next few minutes passed in a blur. The human fleet, now down to half its original number, continued to engage the Kylorians, keeping their attention diverted as Ward and his team made their way toward the assault pods. The breach was imminent, and Ward could feel the cold sweat on his brow as the countdown began. The pods launched from the human ship with incredible speed, rocketing toward the Kylorian flagship. But as they neared the enemy vessel, the Kylorians responded with all their might, sending a deadly hail of laser fire at the incoming pods. One by one, the pods exploded in brilliant flashes, disintegrating before they could reach the flagship. But Ward's pod, his pod, managed to slip through, the Kylorian weapons too focused on the other pods to target him in time. The pod slammed into the hull of the flagship with an earth-shattering impact, and Ward and his team were thrown to the floor as the doors hissed open. "Move! Move! Move!" Ward shouted, leading his team into the enemy ship. The metallic corridors of the Kylorian flagship stretched out before them, cold and alien. Every step felt like an eternity as they moved toward their goal, the temporal cradle. As they made their way deeper into the ship, they encountered heavy resistance. Kylorian soldiers, towering and terrifying in their sleek armor, stormed the hallways. The human team fought back with everything they had, using their limited ammo and hand-to-hand combat to push forward. Every inch gained was costly, each Kylorian soldier fell only after a brutal fight. But they pushed on. Eventually, they reached the heart of the ship, the chamber housing the temporal cradle. It stood there, pulsing with an unnatural energy, surrounded by a force field of shimmering blue light. Ward's heart raced. They were close. So close. "Commander," one of his soldiers shouted, his voice full of awe and terror, "this is it." Ward nodded, but the moment was short-lived. A Kylorian commander, towering and menacing, appeared from the shadows. His eyes glowed with the same unnatural blue as the temporal cradle. He raised his weapon, an energy staff that crackled with deadly power. "This ends here, human," the Kylorian commander snarled, his voice deep and cold. Ward met his gaze, his hand reaching for the blaster at his side. "No. This ends now." The fight was fierce. The Kylorian commander moved with unnatural speed, his strikes relentless and powerful. Ward dodged, his every move calculated, his every breath a gamble. His soldiers fought valiantly, but one by one, they fell. The odds were stacking against them, but Ward refused to give up. This was humanity's last stand. In the final moments of the battle, Ward, using every ounce of strength he had left, managed to close the distance, slamming his fist into the Kylorian commander's chest, knocking him off balance. With a final burst of energy, he reached the temporal cradle and planted the explosive device. He set the timer, 15 seconds. The Kylorian commander rose, fury in his eyes. "You cannot win." Ward met his gaze, bloodied and exhausted, but resolute. "We already have." The explosion ripped through the flagship, sending a shockwave through the ship. The temporal cradle was destroyed. The future had been saved. But as the blast engulfed the chamber, Ward knew this battle had cost everything. There was no victory without sacrifice. And humanity's war was far from over. The void of space was eerily silent after the explosion. The Kylorian flagship, once a symbol of death and domination, had been reduced to a massive, burning hulk. The remaining Kylorian ships, now leaderless and disoriented, retreated into the depths of the galaxy, their fleet broken and scattered. The battle had been won, but at an unimaginable cost. Ward stood alone on the bridge of his flagship, gazing out into the endless expanse of space. The stars, once distant and cold, now felt like silent witnesses to the destruction and sacrifice. The damage to the human fleet was severe. Half of the remaining ships had been destroyed, their crews lost in the chaos of battle. But in that moment, there was also a strange sense of relief. They had stopped the Kylorians from activating the temporal cradle. They had saved the future. He could feel the weight of the loss. His ship, battered and broken, had somehow survived the final assault, but the faces of his fallen comrades lingered in his mind. Soldiers, engineers, and crew members who had given everything to stop the Kylorians from erasing humanity's existence. Ward's hand clenched around the railing, his knuckles white. They were gone, but their sacrifice would not be forgotten. "Commander," Lieutenant Hayes said, her voice soft but full of respect. "We did it. It's over." Ward turned to face her, his eyes heavy with both grief and gratitude. "We won. But at what cost?" Hayes didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The cost was written on their faces, in the wreckage of their fleet, in the silence that had descended upon them. There would be no parade, no grand celebration. The war had changed them all, broken them, but also forged them into something stronger. He glanced around at the remaining crew members. Some were already tending to the wounded, others were working to stabilize the ship. The damage was extensive, but they would survive. They had no choice. As long as even one ship remained, humanity had a chance to rebuild. The transmission from Earth came through just as Ward was about to turn away. The voice of the Earth President crackled through the comms, sounding both relieved and weary. "Commander Ward," the voice said, "the news has reached us. The Kylorian threat has been neutralized. Humanity owes you and your crew a debt we can never repay." Ward nodded, though his heart was heavy. It wasn't just me. It was everyone. The entire fleet. The entire human race. The president's tone softened. "Yes, and we will honor that. But right now, take a moment. Rest. You and your crew have earned it." Ward glanced out at the stars once more. The future was uncertain, but humanity had survived. The battle was over, but the war, against the scars of the past, the rebuilding, the healing, was just beginning. "Thank you," Ward said quietly, his voice hoarse. He disconnected the comms and stood there for a long moment, the silence around him echoing in the stillness. The war had changed everything, but there was one thing that had remained constant: humanity's unyielding will to survive. With a final glance at the stars, Ward turned and walked away, knowing that the fight was over, but the real journey had only just begun. The galaxy was silent in the aftermath of the war. The stars glittered coldly above, indifferent to the lives that had been sacrificed to secure a future that was now uncertain. Humanity had won, but it was a hollow victory, one earned through the deaths of friends, allies, and countless innocents who had given everything in the fight against the Kylorians. Commander Ward stood on the observation deck of the flagship, staring out at the remnants of the battle. The blackened husks of Kylorian ships floated lifeless in the distance, their once menacing shapes now a ghostly reminder of the war that had nearly consumed them all. The human fleet, battered and broken, limped away from the destruction, the survivors beginning the long process of recovery. Ward's thoughts drifted back to the final moments, the last, desperate push to destroy the temporal cradle. They had saved the future, but at what cost? So many had died, so many had given their lives to stop an enemy that seemed unbeatable. And yet, for all the bloodshed, the destruction, the sacrifice, the war had only brought them to the precipice of something far larger than they could have ever imagined. "We did it, didn't we?" Hayes' voice interrupted his thoughts. She had joined him on the deck, standing beside him now, her gaze fixed on the view before them. Ward didn't respond right away. The weight of the victory still hung heavy in the air. "We did. But it's not over." "Not really." Hayes frowned, turning toward him. "What do you mean?" Ward's eyes narrowed as he stared at the stars. The Kylorians were just one threat, one piece of a much larger puzzle. "We've won this battle, but we've made powerful enemies. Enemies who will stop at nothing to erase humanity. And there are still fragments of the temporal cradle out there, pieces of their technology that we haven't fully uncovered yet." Hayes didn't say anything, but her expression darkened. Ward knew she understood. The Kylorians weren't the only danger lurking in the galaxy. The war had uncovered a darkness, a threat beyond anything they could have imagined. And that threat was still out there. As the fleet began its journey home, Ward couldn't shake the feeling that they were not yet safe. The Kylorians had been only one part of the web of enemies in the universe. There were others who watched, who waited, biding their time. The galaxy was far more dangerous than anyone had realized, and humanity's survival had only just begun. "We've earned some rest," Ward said finally, his voice heavy with resolve. But there's no such thing as peace in a galaxy like this. He turned to leave the observation deck, Hayes following him in silence. The future was uncertain, and humanity's place in it was still being written. But one thing was certain, the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Ward stepped into the corridor, a thought lingered in his mind: what other powers, what other civilizations, had watched humanity struggle? And what would they do when they saw that humanity was still standing? The stars outside glimmered, silent witnesses to the storm that was about to come. If you're curious to see what happens next, make sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and stay tuned for more.